Hello, welcome to Psych Boost. This episode is Free Will and Determinism from the Issues and Debate section. Okay, so for this session, if you just remember to write your call now notes, any questions I ask, just note at the bottom. Once the video is finished, complete the section of your mind map and go ahead and read some of the other textbooks and do some additional research to make sure you're ready for class. Okay, Free Will and Determinism. This is quite an in-depth topic. There's quite a lot of key terms that will probably be new to you. And also you just need to understand how they fall together. Before I talk directly about free will or determinism, I'm just going to mention the specialist terminology causal explanation. So science generally has a method of trying to find causal explanations between variables, and psychology is no different. What we like to do is we like to make a change of a variable and then observe a change that happens to another variable. So this is the independent variable we make a change to, and then we see if there's a change in the dependent variable. If there is a change in the dependent variable, we like to say that we can see a causal relationship between the IV and the DV. Whatever we did to the IV has caused a change in the DV. And this generally is thinking about the world much like a billiard table. So if this snooker player hits the white ball and the red goes into the pocket, we can infer that there is a causal relationship between the white ball hitting the red ball and the red ball going into the pocket. More complex systems like the weather, we are able to predict the weather to a quite amazing degree of accuracy quite a few days in advance. It's very impressive considering how complex a system the weather is, but not quite as complex as humans. But we still like to try and infer causal explanations. So here we've got a picture of a young boy who's clearly in not a very nice place. As psychologists, we might suggest a causal relationship between a poor childhood and then bad behavior in adolescence, which then would lead onto prison. Of course, humans are incredibly complex individuals, so we might not just have one causal explanation, but we could also say, well, it's a combination of factors. Perhaps it's a poor childhood, and perhaps it's a genetic issue, as well as maybe a socio-cultural problems going on, and all these factors come together to determine that this young boy will eventually end up in prison. Okay, so let's look at this through two separate paths. Let's say we've got a pair of identical twins, and one twin goes on to have this poor upbringing. The other twin that we've split up has a nice upbringing. Poor upbringing child goes on to a rebellious teenager, and then the good upbringing child goes on to study hard. And then the poor upbringing child ends up in prison, and the well looked after child goes on to have a good career. What we might want to say from this is that the early child in some way was a causal factor in their later adult lives. So this is kind of where we need to be at for the idea about determinism. There are factors in your life that are going to push you to be a particular way. Okay, so we're going to talk about free will first. So of course, there are certain factors which exist in the world. So you have genes, there are unconscious feelings, and you have experiences as you go through life. But when we think about free will is kind of the ability to choose whichever behavior we like without really the constraints that these determining factors would put on us. So we have all of these complex behaviors, such as deciding whether to buy a house or not, or whether we get into a fight or a relationship. Now, for those who subscribe to the idea that we have free will, our behaviors don't come from these determining factors. These behaviors come from free will. Okay, so we have to see free will in contrast against determinism. So determinism against free will is the idea that our behavior is controlled in some way by these determining factors. Okay, there's two different types of determinism. The first type is hard determinism. Now, a hard determinist doesn't see a role at all for free will. Free will might as well not exist in this bottom diagram for a hard determinist. They see all behavior coming from determining factors like genes, unconscious feelings, and previous experiences. It's very much like the billiard table picture I showed you before. So those balls will go down just on the determining factors of how the balls are played. And for a hard determinist, that's exactly the same as how it would work for human behavior. Now for a soft determinist, they go down a slightly different path. They still feel that causal factors are going to strongly influence behavior. However, they like to say that there is a role for free will. Free will does step in. Free will allows the final decision on whether a behavior should go ahead or not. So there's these two slightly conflicting versions of determinism. Either you're going to say it's just determining factors, or you're going to say it's a combination of determining factors with an override switch for free will, or you can say that our behavior is decided entirely by free will. Okay, let's have a little look closer at soft determinism then, because I think it's maybe the harder to get your head around. So clearly in this scenario, we've still got the genetics, we've still got the poor upbringing, we've still got the social unrest, and we've still got that kind of troubled teen life. But the concept is, when it comes to the point where this individual perhaps decides to commit a crime, they have a chance to make a choice. Their free will can then kind of step in and override. And of course they can go and choose to carry on with the crime, but they might choose an entirely different path. They might decide to, I don't know, give up a life of crime and go and sell ice cream. So soft determinism is this role of free will. It's still likely that these determining factors will push an individual down a particular path. But there is this possibility for a soft determinist of free will taking over. Okay, we're going to look at some different types of determinism, and look, they're quite straightforward. So biological determinism is behavior that in some way is controlled by your body. So whether this is your genetics, whether this is the structure of your brain, whether it's the biochemicals that are flowing through it. So biopsych as an approach predicts behavior due to these bodily processes, whether that's the transcribing of genes into behavior or neurochemicals. Another type of determinism is environmental determinism. So this is a concept that your behavior comes from external influences and learnt behavior as you've grown up. So influence of society, teaching you maybe norms and values. So behaviorist psychologists will lean down an environmental determinism route and suggest that your behavior is due to ways of behavior that you've learnt as you've grown. And then finally, we have psychic determinism. Psychic determinism is for psychodynamics, and it's the concept that, of course, we have this unconscious set of emotions and drives and instincts that we don't really have access to. It's not in our conscious. Now, if we're going to say that we make a free choice, it's free will to make a choice, we're kind of suggesting that it's the conscious mind that's making that choice. Now, if the choice is made by the unconscious, then it's not free will, it is determined. So psychic dynamics comes in with we can predict behavior due to the role of the unconscious. Okay, we're going to look at some of the arguments for and against free will. These are effectively evaluation points here. Okay, so for the idea of free will. Well, we have theologians, people of a religious persuasion might argue that free will is needed in order to live a moral life. If you do a good action, it can't be just because you're forced to do a good action. It has to be you choose to act freely and act in a good way. And in the same way, if you're forced to act in a bad way, it's difficult to assign problems with morality if you're not in control of those actions. And a similar argument for the legal system. So if you do a crime, then you really, the legal system would like to see you as accountable for that crime in order to give you punishment. It seems unfair to punish someone for an action that they were completely not in control and didn't have the choice to do. So the legal system and the religious system kind of relies on this concept of free will. That isn't a particularly good piece of evidence to suggest it's real, which is unfortunate. The second point of view is humanistic psychology as a field is very reliant on the idea that free will exists. Other approaches generally are pretty deterministic, some more or less than others. And number three, which is probably the best argument for free will, is it just kind of feels like we have free will. We have this lived experience where it feels like I can make a decision to do one thing, or I can make a decision to do something else, and that's called face validity, and that's perhaps a valid argument, but still, it isn't a particularly strong argument. We could just be deluded into feeling that we have free will, and I'm not sure if there are really any other particular strong arguments for free will. So let's look at some of the arguments against the idea that we live our lives according to free will. Okay. We may find behaviors that we're not able to explain. Perhaps someone is very aggressive, but they don't have the upbringing to explain it. They don't have the genes to explain it. They don't have any causal factors that we would usually assign to aggression. We can't just say that's free will, because perhaps it's not. Perhaps there are other causal factors that we just haven't discovered yet. Okay, 2. Much of psychological research is based on concordance rate, especially the research we looked at for schizophrenia. So if we have a high concordance rate, if we have two twins and they both go on to develop schizophrenia, which is very rare in the population, we would have to conclude that something made it more likely for these individuals to get schizophrenia. Now, the strongest argument is due to these identical twins sharing the same genes, there is a biological determining factor here that makes it far more likely for these individuals to go on to develop schizophrenia. Now, because the concordance rate is not 100% or even close to 100%, there are two options. Either there's a role for free will, there's a possibility for these individuals to not have schizophrenia through a force of will of their own, or possibly more likely, there are other determining factors. There are maybe environmental factors which saved one from schizophrenia while the other one suffered. So maybe one had a particular poor relationship and struggled to get over that. Okay, and then a third argument against free will. This is a set of research by Leiber in 1985 who used an EEG, and he asked individuals to just make a small motor movement and to decide, when to act. But at the moment they decided to move, they needed to record that, and that was checked against the EEG. What the EEG found is actually you could see the decision being made by brain regions before the conscious mind was aware it had made the decision to move. Now that sounds quite complex, but what this means is there was a part of the brain that went, it's time to move, before the conscious mind went, I'm going to move. It's like you were stood in the queue at the ice cream and you were trying to decide which ice cream to have, and a part of your brain went, it's going to have chocolate, and then a couple of seconds later your consciousness went, I think I've just decided to have chocolate. This research has been backed up by fMRI as well, so a more precise brain scanning technique. The problem is the research that is done in this field is quite limited. It is limited to deciding to move your arm. Bigger decisions like whether to buy a house or not can't be studied in this way. So perhaps maybe there's a role for free will in larger life decisions. Okay, so we might be tempted to apply this to some areas of psychology. So we might apply this to relationships. So the evolutionary approach of relationships suggests we start certain relationships due to our biological makeup. We look for certain things in our partners. That means we're not fully in control of making an objective decision about who we start a relationship with. We're kind of the puppets of our genes. Schizophrenia, both the biological and the psychological explanations are both deterministic in the different ways. And any of the aggression biological sections are also quite deterministic. If we need to talk about soft determinism, so we could talk about social learning theory, which is obviously built on earlier learning theories, which are quite environmentally deterministic, but they have a role for mediational processes and kind of a lot of cognitive thinking, which Bandura argued was kind of an opportunity for us to kind of overcome this deterministic route. And also perhaps we can think about Ellis's ABC model, where we have the activating event, the belief and the consequence, which tend to lead off each other. But Ellis's work is an attempt to effectively use free will to change these beliefs and then lead to alternate consequences. So we could argue both of those areas might demonstrate soft determinism. And if we needed to talk about free will, of course, we would be left with the humanistic approach to talk about free will.